At my best friend's funeral, my mother's tears seemed genuine. Only I knew they weren't for her son's dead friend. They were for her dead lover. The day we buried Marcus was deceptively beautiful. Sunlight slanted through the stained glass windows, casting fractured light over Marcus's casket. The air inside the church was thick with incense and whispered condolences, but all I could hear was the steady drum of my own heartbeat, the weight of betrayal pressing down on my chest. I watched my mother, Elizabeth, in her perfectly tailored black dress, dabbing at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. Her performance was flawless, perhaps too flawless. The way her shoulders trembled, how her mascara left deliberate trails down her cheeks, the soft whimpers that escaped her lips at precisely the right moments. I knew better. I had spent the last 18 years studying her expressions, learning to decode the intricate web of lies that made up Elizabeth Morrison. If you love gripping crime stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more thrilling tales to life. 3 weeks ago, everything changed when I found the letters hidden in the false bottom of her jewelry box. The ornate box I had been forbidden to touch throughout my childhood held more than just family heirlooms. It contained the evidence of a decade-long affair between my mother and my best friend. Marcus, at 24, had been barely 6 years older than me. The thought made bile rise in my throat. Detective Sarah Chen's words from yesterday's interview still echoed in my mind. "Ms. Morrison, are you absolutely certain your friend Marcus showed no signs of distress in the days leading up to his death?" Her dark eyes had studied me intently, searching for cracks in my composure. I had simply shaken my head, protecting my mother's secret while simultaneously plotting to destroy her. The letters revealed everything. Their first encounter when Marcus was just 17, working as a lifeguard at our country club pool. My mother, then 35, had initiated what would become an obsessive relationship. Their passionate declarations of love were interwoven with discussions of their future together, a future that would never come to pass, thanks to the cocktail of prescription medications found in Marcus's system. I shifted in the hard wooden pew, remembering the night I discovered Marcus's body in his apartment. The moment I stepped into Marcus's apartment, I knew something was off. Everything was too neat, too perfect. The pill bottles were too neatly lined up on the nightstand. That should have been my first clue. Marcus was many things, but neat wasn't one of them. My father sat beside my mother, his hand resting supportively on her knee. Poor Richard Morrison, successful cardiac surgeon, completely oblivious to the fact that his wife's grief was for her young lover, rather than a family friend. I wondered if he'd noticed the weight of the flash drive in my jacket pocket, containing copies of every letter, every secret phone call recording, every hidden photograph that proved the twisted nature of my mother's relationship with Marcus. Marcus's parents sat in the front row, their grief raw and genuine. Helen, his mother, had practically raised me alongside her son. We'd spent countless summers in their backyard pool, winters sledding down the hill behind their house, and now here we were, mourning a death that grew more suspicious with each passing hour. Detective Chen sat 3 rows behind us, trying to blend in with the mourners. But I knew why she was really here. The toxicology report had raised red flags. The combination and quantity of drugs in Marcus's system suggested something far more sinister than suicide. The investigation was still ongoing, despite my mother's attempts to have it closed quickly. As the priest delivered his eulogy, I recalled the last conversation I'd had with Marcus, just 2 days before his death. He'd been agitated, running his hands through his dark hair the way he always did when troubled. "There's something I need to tell you," he'd said, his voice trembling. "Something that's going to change everything." We'd agreed to meet the following evening, but he never showed up. Instead, I found him dead in his apartment, looking peaceful, in a way that seemed completely wrong for someone who had supposedly taken their own life. The funeral procession moved to the cemetery, where dark clouds had begun gathering overhead. As they lowered the casket, my mother's sobs grew louder, more theatrical. I watched her throw a red rose onto the polished wood, her hands shaking. Behind her designer sunglasses, I caught a glimpse of something in her eyes. Not grief, but relief. That's when I noticed Detective Chen approaching Helen, Marcus's mother, engaging her in what appeared to be casual conversation. But I knew better. Building a case, piece by piece, and Helen's statement would be crucial. What nobody knew was that I had already provided Chen with a key piece of evidence. Security camera footage from Marcus's apartment building, showing my mother entering his unit the night he died and leaving 2 hours later, her perfect composure slightly disheveled. Marcus always felt like someone was watching him. That's why he installed the camera. The reception was held at the Morrison estate, our sprawling home becoming a stage for the final act of this tragedy. I watched my mother play the grieving family friend to perfection, accepting condolences with just the right amount of dignified sorrow. The irony wasn't lost on me. How she stood in our living room, surrounded by photos of our perfect family, while upstairs in her bedroom lay the evidence of her destruction. As guests mingled, I noticed my father in deep conversation with Marcus's father, their heads bent close together. Something in their posture made me pause. That's when I overheard a fragment of their conversation that sent chills down my spine. The insurance policy, substantial payout, beneficiary changed just last month. A fresh wave of realization hit me. The investigation had focused on the drugs, the apparent suicide, the secret affair. But what if there was more? What if my mother's performance today wasn't just about grieving her young lover, but about securing her financial future? I slipped away from the reception, climbing the familiar stairs to my mother's bedroom. The jewelry box sat innocently on her dresser, its false bottom now empty, thanks to me. But as I stood there, something caught my eye, a reflection in the mirror of a slightly ajar drawer. Inside, I found a new stack of papers, insurance documents, bank statements, and a series of emails between my mother and Marcus's financial advisor. And then, a collection of photographs, different young men, all bearing the same haunted expressions. The pieces began falling into place with horrifying clarity. Marcus hadn't just been my mother's lover, he'd been her pawn, manipulated into changing his life insurance policy in her favor. The suicide note, the carefully arranged scene, the specific combination of drugs, it had all been orchestrated by the woman who had perfected the art of deception over decades. Lightning flashed outside as I heard footsteps approaching the bedroom. I quickly replaced the documents and turned to find my mother standing in the doorway, her face a mask of concern. "Darling, what are you doing up here? The guests are asking for you." Our eyes met in the mirror, and in that moment, I saw something shift in her expression, a flicker of recognition, perhaps understanding that I knew everything. The perfect facade cracked, just for a second, revealing the calculating predator beneath. I forced a smile, my voice steady, yet laced with unspoken threat. "It's strange, isn't it, Mother? How the truth always finds its way to the surface." "How much, Mom?" My voice cracked. "How much was Marcus worth to you?" Her face remained unreadable, but something flickered in her eyes, just for a second. "I don't know what you're talking about," she murmured. I swallowed hard. "You killed him." The color drained from her face, but her composure never wavered. "I don't know what you're talking about. The grief is clearly affecting you more than I realized." Footsteps sounded behind me. A firm, measured voice cut through the silence. "Elizabeth Morrison." Detective Chen stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 officers. "We need you to come with us." For the first time, my mother hesitated, just for a second. Then she smiled, a slow, triumphant smile. What happened next would be whispered about in our small town for years to come. My mother, the perfect society wife, didn't break down. She didn't plead. She didn't deny. She smiled, a slow, cold, triumphant smile that sent ice through my veins. And then she said something that would haunt me forever. "You'll understand when you're older, James. Some people are worth more dead." Her voice was smooth, almost gentle, as if explaining a simple truth rather than confessing to something monstrous. The investigation that followed tore through our lives like wildfire. Buried secrets clawed their way to the surface, exposing a pattern that spanned decades. Detective Chen slid a folder across the table. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the edge. "You need to see this," she said. I opened it. 3 faces stared back at me. 3 young men, Michael Stevens, Christopher Hayes, David Parker, different names, different cities, different years. A chill crept up my spine as I saw it. The same confident smile, the same sharp jawline, the same look Marcus had. "Tell me this is a coincidence," I whispered. Chen exhaled slowly. "I wish I could." Each case was tied to Elizabeth Morrison, under different names, different identities. It was a carefully constructed web of deception, each thread leading to the same cold, calculated end. How long had she been playing this game? And more terrifyingly, who else had she decided was worth more dead? I pored over the case files, each report detailing a suspicious death. The timelines aligned too perfectly with moments from my mother's past, times when she had vanished, only to reappear under a new alias. The financial records were damning. Insurance payouts, sudden wealth, unexplained bank transfers. It wasn't an accident. It was a method. She had perfected it. Late at night, I sat in my room staring at old family photos. The smiling faces now felt hollow. The memories, once warm, seemed tainted, laced with an underlying malice I had been too blind to see. Had my father's death truly been an accident? Or had she orchestrated that too? The town buzzed with speculation. Whispers in grocery aisles, murmured theories in coffee shops. And while my mother sat behind bars, awaiting trial, her smile never faded. Not in the courtroom, not during the news reports, not even when I saw her in the visitor's room, staring at me through the thick pane of glass. I picked up the receiver, my heart pounding. "Why?" My voice barely rose above a whisper. She simply tilted her head, that same eerie smile curving her lips. "You already know, James." My mother wasn't just a manipulative lover. She was a serial killer who had perfected her craft through years of practice. As I watched them lead her away in handcuffs, her designer dress immaculate even in arrest, I realized that the tears she'd shed at Marcus's funeral weren't just for her dead lover. They were tears of victory, of another performance successfully executed. But this would be her final act. The evidence I'd gathered, combined with Detective Chen's investigation, ensured that Elizabeth Morrison's curtain call would be in a courtroom, facing multiple murder charges. The truth about Marcus's death brought no peace, only more questions. How many others had there been? How many families had she destroyed? And most haunting of all, how had I lived with this monster for 18 years without seeing her true nature? As I stood in the empty house that night, surrounded by the remnants of the funeral reception, I found one last letter hidden in Marcus's old jacket. A letter he'd written to me, but never delivered. In it, he revealed that he'd discovered my mother's past and had planned to expose her. He died trying to protect me from the truth about the woman who had given me life. The rain finally broke outside, washing away the last traces of the funeral day. But nothing could wash away the knowledge that my mother's tears at my best friend's funeral had been her most convincing performance yet. Not tears of loss, but tears of triumph in another perfectly executed plan. And as I heard the distant sirens fading into the night, I wondered how many other children out there were just beginning to discover the monsters hiding behind their mothers' perfect smiles. I never thought I'd find comfort in a police interrogation room, but here I was, 3 days after Marcus's funeral, feeling more at home under these harsh, fluorescent lights than I had in my own house for weeks. Detective Sarah Chen sat across from me, her case files spread across the metal table like tarot cards, predicting my mother's downfall. "Let's go through it again, James," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Tell me about the day you found the letters." I closed my eyes, letting myself drift back to that rainy Tuesday afternoon. The house had been empty, Mom at her charity luncheon, Dad at the hospital performing another life-saving surgery. I'd been looking for my grandmother's old locket in Mom's room, something to wear to Marcus's funeral. The jewelry box had always been off-limits, a forbidden treasure chest of sorts. But with Marcus gone, I'd stopped caring about rules. The false bottom wasn't even that well hidden, I explained, my voice hollow. It's like she wanted someone to find it. Then I found an old photo of a young man, too. Maybe she got off on the risk. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through the photos I'd taken of the letters. The earliest one is dated June 15th, 7 years ago. Marcus was 17. Detective Chen leaned forward, her dark eyes intent. "Read it to me again." My hands shook as I began reading. "My dearest Elizabeth, today by the pool, when you smiled at me, I felt my whole world shift. I know it's wrong. You're my best friend's mother, for God's sake. But I can't stop thinking about how your hand felt on my arm, how your perfume lingered in the air long after you walked away. I'm just a kid with a summer job, but you make me feel like so much more." "And your mother's response?" Chen prompted. I flipped to the next photo. She wrote back the same day, "Sweet Marcus, youth isn't measured in years, but in the fire that burns within us. When I look at you, I see a man where others see a boy. Meet me tonight at the old boathouse. I'll show you exactly what I see." The investigation had started as a routine suicide inquiry. Marcus Williams, 24, found dead in his apartment from an apparent overdose. But Chen had noticed inconsistencies from the start. The positioning of the body was too perfect, the suicide note too polished. And then there were the bruises on his wrists, subtle but present. "Tell me about the night you found him," Chen said, turning to a fresh page in her notebook. I swallowed hard, the memory still raw. "I had a key to his place. We were supposed to meet that night. He said he had something important to tell me. When he didn't show up at our usual spot, I went to check on him." My voice cracked. The apartment was spotless. That should have been my first clue. Marcus was many things, but neat wasn't one of them. The memories flooded back. The immaculate living room, the carefully arranged pill bottles, the way his body lay on the bed like a staged photograph. He was wearing his favorite blue button-down shirt, freshly pressed, every button perfectly aligned. "And the note?" Chen asked. "I'm sorry for the pain I've caused. The weight of secrets becomes too heavy to bear. Please forgive me." It was typed, not handwritten. Marcus never typed personal notes. He was old school that way. Always said handwritten letters had soul. Chen nodded, making another note. "When did you first suspect your mother's involvement?" This was the part that still made my stomach turn. "After finding the letters, I started paying attention to little things. The way she'd disappear for hours, claiming she was at yoga or book club. And I remember James telling me he had started recording everything. I should trust no one. Her phone always on silent, always password protected. But it was her reaction to his death that really gave her away." I remembered the morning we got the news. Dad had answered the phone, his face growing grave. But Mom, she'd known before he even said the words. There had been no shock in her eyes, only a calculated shift into performance mode. She started crying before Dad even told us what happened, I explained. It was like watching an actress step into character. Every sob, every trembling hand movement. It was choreographed perfection. The investigation took a turn when Chen's team discovered the security footage. My mother entering Marcus's building at 9:47 p.m. the night he died, leaving at 11:52 p.m. her elegant figure unmistakable even in the grainy footage. "Tell me about the insurance policy," Chen said, pulling out another file. This had been the piece that turned a suspicious death into something far more sinister. 2 weeks before his death, Marcus had changed his life insurance beneficiary. The new recipient? A shell company that traced back to my mother through a maze of paperwork. $5 million, I said quietly. That's what my best friend's life was worth to her. But the true horror was yet to come. As Chen's team dug deeper, they found connections to other cases. 3 other young men in different cities over the past 20 years, all bearing striking resemblances to Marcus, all dead under suspicious circumstances, all with connections to various aliases my mother had used. "James," Chen said softly, "we need to talk about the others." The next hours were a blur of photographs, police reports, and death certificates. Michael Stevens, 19, found drowned in his bathtub in Seattle, 2005. Christopher Hayes, 22, carbon monoxide poisoning in his garage in Denver, 2010. David Parker, 20, apparent hiking accident in Portland, 2015. Each case initially ruled as accident or suicide, each victim having some connection to my mother under different names. "How did nobody notice?" I asked, my voice breaking. Had I ever truly known my mother? Or had I just been another fool caught in her web? Chen's response was calm but unwavering, his words measured yet laced with an undeniable certainty. "Skilled predators excel at hiding in plain sight," he said, his gaze steady. "Your mother built her entire life around maintaining appearances. The perfect wife, the devoted mother, the charitable socialite, all carefully orchestrated, a facade so seamless that even those closest to her never thought to question it." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing against my chest. It had always been there, the nagging sense that something wasn't quite right. The way she smiled too easily, how her words were always perfectly chosen, never a syllable out of place. But I had ignored it. I had wanted to believe in the illusion she so masterfully crafted. Then came the breakthrough, 3 days after the funeral. For years, my mother had perfected the art of control. Through multiple interrogations, endless questions, and relentless scrutiny, she had remained composed. Never once did she falter. No misplaced word, no flicker of doubt. She was untouchable, unshakable. Until Chen's team found something in Marcus's apartment that changed everything. A hidden camera. Marcus had installed it in the weeks leading up to his death, tucking it away in a place no one would ever think to check. A silent observer, unseen but watchful. The footage was grainy, distorted at the edges, but the content was damning. My mother, stepping into his apartment on that final night, her posture rigid, movements controlled. Even in the shadowed footage, she exuded the same effortless poise she always had. But there was something else, something raw lurking beneath the surface. The argument played out in disjointed pieces, the audio marred by static, but enough was clear. The clipped edge in her voice, the urgency in his. Words sharpened into weapons, striking deeper with every exchange. "You can't keep this hidden forever," Marcus had said, his voice tight with frustration. "You have no idea what you're talking about," my mother had shot back, her tone as smooth as glass. But there was an undercurrent, something rare, something real, fear. And then, silence, a sharp movement, a figure blocking the camera's view, and Marcus was never seen alive again. I exhaled shakily, my fingers gripping the edge of the table. The room felt too small, the air too thick. Chen watched me carefully. "We can't say for certain what happened after that," he admitted. "But we know she was there. And we know he didn't walk out of that apartment alive." The carefully woven illusion was beginning to unravel. And for the first time in my life, I realized I had never known my mother at all. "You can't just end this, Marcus. We have plans. It's over, Elizabeth. I'm telling James everything. You wouldn't dare. He deserves to know the truth about you, about the others. The next part of the footage was missing, corrupted or deliberately erased. But the final frames showed my mother calmly arranging pills on his nightstand, methodically typing the suicide note on his laptop. When confronted with the video evidence, something in my mother finally broke. Her confession came not in tears or remorse, but in a chilling monologue that revealed the true depths of her depravity. "You want to know how it started?" she'd asked Detective Chen, her voice eerily calm. "He was so beautiful by that pool, so full of life. They all were, young men at the peak of their potential, thinking they could save me from my ordinary life. But they all made the same mistake, thinking they could leave when they wanted to." She described each death with clinical detachment, how she'd groomed them, manipulated them, made them dependent on her emotionally and financially. And when they threatened to expose her or leave her, she orchestrated their ends with meticulous precision. Marcus was special, though, she'd continued, a small smile playing on her lips. He lasted the longest, 7 years of perfect devotion. But then he grew a conscience. Started talking about telling James, about making things right. Her smile had turned cruel. I couldn't let that happen. The trial was a media sensation. The perfect suburban mother revealed as a calculating black widow, every detail of her double life exposed, the fake identities, the offshore accounts, the trail of broken families she'd left across the country. Dad retreated into his work, unable to face the reality that his entire marriage had been a lie. I found him late one night in his study, surrounded by old photo albums, trying to pinpoint the moment his wife had become a monster, or if she'd been one all along. The hardest part was facing Marcus's parents. Helen and Robert Williams had lost their only son, and I had lost my best friend. But the truth about his relationship with my mother had tainted even our shared grief. "I'm so sorry," I'd told Helen at the courthouse after the verdict was read. "I should have seen it, should have stopped it." Helen had taken my hands in hers, her eyes full of tears, but also understanding. "We all should have seen it, James. She fooled everyone. My mother was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." As they led her away, she turned to me one last time, her mask finally completely gone. "I did love him, you know," she said, her voice soft but steady. "In my own way." "That's the problem, Mom," I replied. "Your way of loving destroys everything it touches." Months later, I found myself back at Marcus's grave. The headlines had faded, the trial was over, but the questions remained. I placed a single white rose on his headstone and took out one last letter, one I'd written but would never send. "Dear Marcus, I found the truth you tried to tell me. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. I'm sorry she used our friendship as a weapon. But most of all, I'm sorry you had to carry this burden alone. You tried to protect me from her, and it cost you everything. I hope wherever you are, you're finally free of her web of lies. I hope you know that despite everything, you're still my best friend. Rest easy, brother. Justice may not heal all wounds, but at least now we both know the truth about the tears she shed at your funeral. They weren't for the son's friend she'd lost, but for the perfect lie that finally came undone. Forever your friend, James." As I walked away from the cemetery, a light rain began to fall, washing away the last traces of my mother's perfect facade. If Marcus hadn't uncovered her secrets, how long would it have taken me to see my mother for what she really was? And what about you? Would you know if someone you loved was a predator in disguise? Some truths destroy us, but ignoring them, that's what lets the real monsters win. So, I ask you, how well do you really know the people closest to you? If this story left you thinking, don't keep it to yourself. Like, share, and subscribe for more dark, twisted tales. Let's keep the conversation going. And remember, the truth always finds its way to the surface.